Okay, so I thought it would be good to go through and work through an example of if they ask you to find the trig values in relation to an angle theta, and they've given us the following triangle. Now you'll notice if I'm kind of looking at this triangle, it's got a right angle here in this corner. It's 90 degrees or pi over 2 radians there in that corner. Okay, so any of these problems where they've asked you to calculate the trig value, that's definitely got to be the case, that it's a right angle triangle. Now they've clearly labeled theta here. Okay, so that's the angle there that they want all of the trig values in relation to. They've given us the length of this particular side, it's 3. They've given us the length of this side, it's 5. But this last side over here, we don't know what that side length is. That wasn't given, but maybe we could go through and solve for it. So the first thing that I like to do on these types of problems is I actually like to go through and label the sides as either hypotenuse, opposite, or adjacent. Now, for me personally, I like to go through and label the hypotenuse side first. One, because it's the easiest to pick out. It's the longest side. It also is the one that is not touching this right angle at all. Okay? So I know that I'm going to label that side as the hypotenuse. So I'll just label it hypotenuse there. So that's this particular side. Okay. Now this side here, okay, is right next to this angle theta. Okay. It's right next to that angle theta. It's not the hypotenuse side. So it has to be the adjacent side. That angle and that side are adjacent to each other. So I'm just going to label this side here. Oops, not in yellow, in blue, the adjacent side. Okay. So that leaves us with the last side over here being the opposite side. And it might be just useful to double check and think about this. This side here is completely opposite to the angle theta. So they're not touching, they're on complete opposite sides of the triangle. So this kind of makes sense. Okay, so we've labeled our 3 sides. And remember we said that we had the side lengths for these 2 sides, but we didn't have one over here on this side. So there's something that allows us to go through and calculate that. Anyone remember? All right, so that's the Pythagorean theorem, right? And so we want to go through and plug in what we know. So we don't know the adjacent, so I'm going to leave that as adjacent squared. But we know the opposite side length is 3, so I'll plug that in. And we know the hypotenuse side length is 5, so I'm going to plug that in. And now we're going to use our algebra to go through and solve for a. So a squared plus 3 squared is 9, 5 squared is 25. And then I'd subtract 9 from both sides. So 25 minus 9 gives me 16. Then from there, I'm going to square root both sides. Now, usually when I do the square root, I have to remember to do the plus or minus the square root, right? Now, in this case, oops, in this case, it'll end up being minus 4 and plus 4. But because we're dealing with side lengths in a triangle, I'm only going to take the positive one. I just want to be really purposeful about that choice. Okay, so we now have our sides. I guess I better go in and label this side over here as 4, right? I label this side here as 4. And now I've definitely labeled all 4 sides. Now, if they've asked us to find the trig values, we better have memorized all the different rules for calculating the trig values, right? We have to calculate the sine, the cosine, the tangent, and we have to know, you know, what side over what side gives me each of the different trig values. There's 6 of them. So hopefully you have those memorized. So I'm just going to put them here. If those aren't something you have memorized, you need to spend some time sitting down and trying to get them memorized as soon as possible. Okay, so let's see here. So let's plug in some values. So the sine here, it says is opposite, right? So opposite is this side over the hypotenuse, which is this side, right? So if I plug that in, I'm going to get 3 over 5. Okay. And oops, let me get rid of this here. Get rid of that highlight. There we go. So sine is 3 over 5. Now the cosine, it says, is adjacent over hypotenuse. So when I plug in values there, it's going to end up being 4 over 5. Okay. Sorry, I'm kind of scrolling over. I'll try to not do that. The opposite over adjacent is going to end up being 3 over 4. So that's the tan. Now over here on this side for the cosecant is hypotenuse over opposite. The hypotenuse is 5. The opposite is 3. So the cosecant of this angle is 5 over 3. The secant is hypotenuse over adjacent, so that's going to be 5 over 4. And last but not least, adjacent over opposite. So the adjacent is 4, and the opposite was 3. So everything looks good there. So let's just double check everything makes sense. I think so. So we've now found all 6 trig values for this particular triangle.